June 10, 1944. The wounded continued to arrive in endless waves, their bodies broken and bleeding, expressions vacant from shock and trauma. 4 days after the greatest amphibious landing in military history, the casualties showed no sign of slowing. The makeshift field hospital 2 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach operated beyond capacity, a desperate assembly line of suffering where the boundary between life and death was measured in minutes and maintained by exhausted medical personnel operating on instinct and determination. Lieutenant Eleanor Hayes wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, careful not to smear more blood on her face. The 28-year-old nurse from Boston hadn't slept in 36 hours. Around her, the organized chaos of the 128th Evacuation Hospital pulsed with urgent activity, surgeons working frantically, medics rushing between cots, nurses attempting to stabilize the most critical cases before they could be moved to surgery. Outside the canvas tents, the distinctive thump of artillery fire punctuated the distant symphony of war, a reminder that the battle raged on just miles away, ensuring more casualties would soon arrive. The relentless Normandy sun beat down on the canvas tents, creating a stifling greenhouse effect inside. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of blood, antiseptic, and the unmistakable odor of death that clung to everything despite their best efforts. Eleanor moved methodically between patients, her once white uniform now stained various shades of crimson. Her hands, steady and precise, belied her exhaustion as she checked vital signs and adjusted intravenous lines. She'd been among the first nurses to land in Normandy, arriving just after the initial assault waves had secured a tenuous foothold. What she found was a medical nightmare. Hundreds of wounded men awaiting treatment, many suffering from catastrophic blood loss. The traditional blood transfusion protocols they'd trained for in England were proving woefully inadequate for the scale of this catastrophe. Blood plasma, the miracle innovation they'd relied upon, wasn't enough for the most severe cases of shock. Many men were dying while waiting for whole blood transfusions that couldn't be administered quickly enough. Eleanor paused at the bedside of a young paratrooper, barely 20 years old, his skin ashen from blood loss after a German machine gun had torn through his leg. The surgeon had managed to save the limb, but now the boy teetered on the precipice between life and death, desperately needing whole blood to replace what he'd lost. "Nurse, we need blood here now," called Dr. Phillips from 3 beds down, where another soldier lay hemorrhaging from a shrapnel wound to the abdomen. Eleanor glanced between the 2 critical patients, knowing there were a dozen more in similar condition throughout the tent. They simply didn't have enough personnel to administer individual transfusions at the pace required. The blood supply itself was adequate. The revolutionary blood banking system had ensured that, but the process of setting up each transfusion took precious time they didn't have. Eleanor had watched too many young men die while waiting their turn. In that moment, a radical thought occurred to her. The standard procedure required careful, individual monitoring of each blood transfusion, a dedicated nurse watching the flow rate, checking for reactions, adjusting the equipment. It was protocol developed in peacetime hospitals, not designed for the overwhelming tsunami of casualties they now faced. Eleanor made a decision that would have been unthinkable in her Boston teaching hospital. "Miller," she called to the nearest medic, "bring me all the transfusion kits we have, and get me something to hang them from, tent poles, rifle barrels, anything." The medic looked confused but nodded and rushed off. Within minutes, Eleanor had improvised a central transfusion station, a crude rack assembled from stretcher poles and broomsticks suspended between cots. From this, she hung multiple blood bottles, creating a line of transfusions that could be monitored in groups rather than individually. "What in God's name are you doing, Lieutenant?" Dr. A. Crawford, the senior medical officer, stood at the entrance to the tent, his face a mask of shock and disapproval. Eleanor didn't pause as she inserted a needle into a soldier's arm. "Saving lives, sir. One nurse can monitor 6 transfusions this way, instead of being tied to a single patient. We're losing too many while they wait." Crawford's medical training screamed against this deviation from protocol. "This is dangerous, Hayes. Blood transfusions require individual monitoring for adverse reactions. If something goes wrong..." Eleanor cut him off, something she'd never have dared before Normandy. "With respect, sir, they're already dying. I've grouped compatible blood types together. I can watch for reactions across the group. It's a calculated risk against the certainty that many will die waiting." The doctor's expression wavered between outrage and desperate pragmatism. Around them, moans from the wounded created a grim chorus that made the decision for him. "On your head be it, Lieutenant, but I want detailed observations of every patient." He turned and strode away, shaking his head at the unorthodox method. Within an hour, Eleanor's impromptu transfusion system was operating across 3 tents. Nurses who initially balked at the deviation from procedure quickly recognized its efficiency. They arranged patients in groups by blood type, hung multiple units simultaneously, and monitored them collectively, watching for the telltale signs of transfusion reaction, fever, chills, hives, while still being able to tend to other critical needs. The effect was immediate and profound. More wounded received blood faster, fewer died waiting, and the medical staff could distribute their attention more effectively across the overwhelming number of patients. When a new wave of ambulances arrived from the beachhead that evening, they were ready. Eleanor worked through another night, moving between her groups of patients, adjusting flow rates, checking for reactions, all while continuing other essential nursing duties. Her innovation, born of desperation and pragmatism, gradually transformed into a deliberate system. By dawn on June 11th, word of the Hayes method had spread to neighboring field hospitals. A medical officer from the 42nd Field Hospital arrived to observe, skeptical until he saw the results. More patients receiving critical transfusions with the same limited nursing staff. "We need this at our station," he admitted, watching Eleanor demonstrate the technique to another nurse. "Our casualties are just as heavy and we're losing too many to shock." Eleanor nodded wearily, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Take the idea, doctor. It's not perfect, but it's better than watching them die for lack of hands." She didn't mention the opposition she'd faced, the whispered criticisms from some medical officers who considered her method reckless. All that mattered were the lives being saved, young men who would otherwise have become statistics in the growing tally of D-Day casualties. The blood-stained fields of Normandy became a crucible for medical innovation during those desperate weeks following the invasion. Traditional protocols, designed for controlled hospital environments, bent under the weight of unprecedented casualties and limited resources. Eleanor's system evolved further as other nurses refined it, adding their own modifications. They discovered that hanging blood bottles from tent guy ropes in the open air, previously thought impossible because conventional wisdom dictated blood needed warming, worked perfectly well with no adverse effects. They improvised warming methods using the engine heat from parked ambulances when the weather turned cool. Each adaptation emerged from necessity rather than formal research, battlefield innovations that would eventually transform transfusion medicine. By the end of June, what had begun as Eleanor's desperate improvisation had become standard procedure across the Normandy beachhead medical units, with modifications and improvements implemented by dozens of nurses and doctors faced with similar circumstances. The human cost of the Normandy campaign mounted with each passing day, yet beneath the grim statistics of casualties lay another story, one of lives salvaged through medical ingenuity and courage. 3 weeks after D-Day, as the Allied forces pushed inland toward Cherbourg, an Army medical review team arrived from England to assess the battlefield medical response. Colonel James Harrison, a veteran physician from Walter Reed Hospital, interviewed medical personnel about their experiences and adaptations. When he reached the 128th Evacuation Hospital, Eleanor's transfusion system immediately caught his attention. By now, the crude improvisation had evolved into a more refined procedure, with dedicated equipment fashioned by unit mechanics and engineers. "This method violates every transfusion protocol I'm familiar with," Harrison remarked, watching a nurse monitor 6 simultaneous transfusions. "Yet your mortality rates from hemorrhagic shock are lower than any other unit I've assessed." Eleanor, now serving as transfusion coordinator for the hospital, stood her ground before the distinguished physician. "War medicine isn't hospital medicine, Colonel. When you have 300 casualties and 30 nurses, you adapt or you watch patients die." Her voice carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and hard-earned wisdom. The shadows under her eyes testified to the relentless pace she'd maintained, but there was also a quiet pride in her bearing. By their best estimates, the modified transfusion protocols had already saved over 800 lives across the Normandy medical units, soldiers who would otherwise have died awaiting individual treatment. Harrison's subsequent report would bring official recognition to what frontline medical personnel already knew. Battlefield necessity had forced a fundamental reconsideration of transfusion practice, with results that couldn't be ignored by the medical establishment. The Hayes method would eventually be incorporated into Army field medical training, though sanitized and formalized in a way that obscured its desperate origins. The beautiful Norman countryside continued its transformation into a vast military staging ground as summer progressed. Ancient hedgerows witnessed modern warfare at its most brutal, while medieval towns became waypoints in a grinding campaign of attrition. Through it all, the medical units followed the advancing front, setting up field hospitals in orchards, farmyards, and abandoned buildings. Eleanor found herself transferred to a forward surgical unit in mid-July, bringing her modified transfusion techniques to support combat operations near St. Lo. The heavy fighting for this strategic crossroads generated casualties comparable to the initial landings, testing the medical services to their limits once again. The transfusion system that had begun as her desperate improvisation was now saving lives daily, implemented by nurses who had never heard her name. Some called it the Normandy method, others the assembly line. Medical officers with more traditional sensibilities still grumbled about protocol violations, but few could argue with the results. On a rare quiet evening in late July, Eleanor sat outside her tent, watching the golden Norman sunset paint the war-torn landscape. Nearby, the low murmur of wounded men drifted from the recovery tents. A medical officer she didn't recognize approached, lighting a cigarette. "Lieutenant Hayes, I'm Captain Robert Williams, Army Medical Corps Evaluation Team." He sat beside her without waiting for an invitation. "I've been tracking the implementation of your transfusion system across the Normandy medical units." Eleanor tensed slightly. Despite the widespread adoption of her method, she still encountered resistance from traditionalists. "I'm just a nurse who found a way to keep more soldiers alive with the resources we had, Captain." Williams nodded, exhaling smoke that drifted away on the gentle evening breeze. "That's precisely why I'm here. Your innovation has saved an estimated 1,200 lives so far, by our conservative count. The Surgeon General's office is formalizing the procedure for wider implementation." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. After weeks of justifying her methods to skeptical medical officers, official recognition seemed almost unreal. "They're calling it the Multiple Casualty Transfusion Protocol," Williams continued, "though everyone in the field still calls it the Hayes method." He smiled slightly. "Some of the old guard physicians back in Washington nearly had apoplexy when they heard how you'd modified sacred transfusion protocols. But results speak louder than tradition." Eleanor watched the last light fade from the horizon, thinking of the hundreds of faces that had passed through her care, some returning to the fight, others evacuated to England, too many buried in the expanding American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. "We didn't have a choice," she said simply. "When there are more dying men than you have hands to help them, you find a way to make each pair of hands count for more." The lessons learned in the blood-soaked fields of Normandy would echo long after the war. Eleanor Hayes returned to Boston in 1945, her experiences transforming her approach to nursing practice and education. The multiple casualty transfusion protocol became standard in military medicine, and aspects of the system eventually filtered into civilian disaster response protocols. Like many wartime innovations, it emerged not from research laboratories, but from the desperate creativity of those at the front lines, forced to reconcile textbook medicine with the overwhelming reality of modern warfare. The story of how one nurse's crazy shortcut saved 1,200 lives became part of medical folklore, told in nursing schools as an example of how necessity drives innovation. Yet for Eleanor, the true measure of her contribution wasn't found in medical journals or training manuals, but in the letters she occasionally received from men who had lain near death on the Norman soil, their lives suspended in the balance until a critical transfusion arrived just in time. The beaches of Normandy have long since returned to peaceful shores where children play and tourists wander. The Great Invasion exists now in monuments, museums, and the fading memories of those who were there. But beneath these visible reminders lies another legacy, the medical innovations born of desperate circumstances that continue to save lives today. For in the crucible of that terrible summer of 1944, when humanity witnessed both the depths of its capacity for destruction and the heights of its ability to heal, individuals like Eleanor Hayes reminded us of our remarkable adaptability in the face of overwhelming odds. The blood that soaked into Norman soil has long since washed away, but the knowledge purchased at such terrible cost remains, a quiet testament to those who found ways to preserve life amid the machinery of death. If you stand on those peaceful beaches today and listen carefully to the whisper of the waves, perhaps you might hear the echo of their story, of hands that moved with purpose through the chaos, of minds that refused to accept the limitations of convention when lives hung in the balance, and of hearts that held fast to hope when surrounded by despair.